Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into the incredibly gripping story of a true, fearless pioneer. We're looking at a woman whose life was so completely wild, it genuinely defies belief. But, we aren't going to start this journey up in the sky. Actually, we're going to start with a pretty shocking confession from one of history's absolute greatest writers.
Get this, back in 1942, the famously, egotistical Ernest Hemingway wrote a letter to his editor containing this exact quote. Now, Hemingway was a guy who was not exactly known for his humility, right? Yet here he is, openly admitting that a newly published memoir made him feel like a total amateur. He literally called himself a carpenter with words, just awkwardly nailing things together compared to her.
So that brings us to a fascinating mystery. Who on earth could force Ernest Hemingway, of all people, to question his own writing abilities? Who had the kind of life experience and raw, undeniable talent to make a literary titan feel like a total beginner?
Well, her name was Beryl Markham. She was the author of the 1942 masterpiece, West with the Night. And here is the really fascinating thing about her. She didn't learn to write by sitting in some fancy Parisian cafe or a stuffy university classroom. No way. Her eloquence was entirely forged through a life of raw, dangerous survival.
Let's rewind the clock back to 1906. At just 4 years old, she was taken from the manicured, super-civilized lawns of England and dropped straight into the untamed frontier of British East Africa, what we know today as Kenya. Growing up, she was literally out there hunting barefoot with spears alongside the local Kipsigis warriors and her dogs. And by the time she hit her teenage years, she wasn't just surviving, she was conquering. She actually became the first female licensed racehorse trainer in all of Africa. Her environment was, as you can imagine, incredibly unforgiving. Her mother actually couldn't handle the intense isolation of the frontier and moved back to England early on. So Beryl was raised entirely by her father and the local Kipsigis tribe. Just imagine this for a second. She grew up speaking Swahili and Kipsigis completely fluently before she could even properly read English. This deeply unconventional upbringing forged a woman who possessed absolutely zero fear of the unknown.
Which leads us to our first section. From the ground to the sky, the bush pilot.
Taught to fly by the legendary Tom Campbell Black, she dove headfirst into the incredibly dangerous early days of aviation. Now, being a bush pilot wasn't like hopping on a commercial flight today. Aviation back then was deadly. It was completely unmapped. She was flying these small planes into remote, rugged terrains with zero radios, no GPS, and absolutely no established runways.
But of course, Beryl wasn't interested in standard routes. She actually went ahead and invented an entirely new, insanely high-risk profession. She started flying her tiny canvas and wood plane completely alone over the Serengeti, specifically to scout the massive shadows of elephant herds for hunters.
Every single day she went to work, the stakes were literally life or death. She's navigating these incredibly violent thermal drafts in a fragile little aircraft, right? She has to scout entirely visually. And the grim, unavoidable reality was this: if your engine failed over the African bush, you were simply gone. You belonged to the lions of the landscape below. There was no rescue team coming for you.
And that brings us to Section 2, the impossible flight across the Atlantic.
Now, we all know Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, right? But he flew from New York to Paris, west to east, which meant he was riding the prevailing tailwinds. It was a huge help. Almost no one wanted to attempt the exact opposite route. But Beryl, she decided she would be the very first person to attempt a solo, non-stop flight from England to North America, flying east to west. That meant flying straight into a brutal, unrelenting wall of wind that severely slowed planes down and literally sucked their fuel tanks dry.
So she takes off in her beautifully named turquoise and silver plane, the Messenger. But the conditions inside that cockpit were anything but beautiful. She was battling a severe storm, with heavy ice forming all over the wings. But perhaps the most terrifying detail of the whole shebang, she had no fuel gauge, none. She relied entirely on a wristwatch to calculate exactly when a tank should be empty, just so she could manually switch the fuel lines in the dark.
Just take a moment to imagine the sheer terror of this number. 20. 20 hours of flying completely blind in a violent storm, battling freezing rain over the black, icy ocean, completely alone, just trusting a watch and her own raw instincts.
And then, right in the pitch black, the absolute worst-case scenario happens. The fuel line freezes solid.
Starved of fuel, the engine sputters, chokes, and then just dies completely. The propeller simply stops spinning in midair.
Suddenly, there is total, absolute silence up there, save for the howling wind outside. She begins falling out of the sky, plunging toward the freezing black ocean. She is plunging toward the water, but in just an incredible display of skill and sheer nerve, she actually manages to restart her engine at the last possible second. She fights those brutal headwinds for as long as she physically can until, finally, she crash lands nose first into a peat bog in Nova Scotia, Canada. Now, she hadn't made it all the way to New York, but she survived. Bloodied, utterly exhausted, and literally sinking into the mud, she physically crawled out of that wrecked plane. And in doing so, she officially cemented herself in history. She achieved the very first solo non-stop east-to-west Atlantic crossing. She made the impossible entirely possible.
Moving into Section 3, a masterpiece lost and found, the legacy of Beryl Markham.
You see, she brought the exact same fearless intensity to the page that she brought to the sky. Her memoir, West with the Night, was published in 1942, but amidst the massive global chaos of World War II, it kind of just faded into obscurity. It wasn't until the 1980s that a restaurateur miraculously discovered Hemingway's old letters, read his glowing praise, and actually tracked the book down. It was republished and instantly became a massive, runaway bestseller.
So what's the big takeaway from this explainer today? Why does Beryl Markham matter so much to us now? Well, it's because her story is about so much more than just the early days of aviation. It is a profound testament to a woman who absolutely refused to let society dictate what she could do. She refused to let gravity tie her down, and most importantly, she refused to let fear dictate the boundaries of her life. I want to leave you all with this final thought. Grab a copy of this forgotten masterpiece if you haven't yet. I promise you will not regret it. And hey, I would absolutely love to hear from you. What is your favorite true adventure story? Let us know in the comments below and keep exploring those impossible boundaries.